Hello everyone and welcome to this episode of The Workers' Voices. My name is Mamadou Kabasware and today we will have a conversation with a special guest. Mr. Claude Akpokavie is the former trade unionist, but also an ILO colleague who is preparing his retirement after 2 decades of work in the ILO. Claude is also the senior advisor to the Office of the ILO Assistant Director General for External and Corporate Relations. Good afternoon, Claude.
Good afternoon.
Welcome to this episode of Workers' Voices.
Thank you so much.
So, Claude, you can imagine that this conversation is very special. That's it. So, after 20 years of services, you are getting ready to retire. What are your feelings at the moment?
Well, I must say I have mixed feelings because I've spent probably all my professional life in the trade union. Well, I started with in the university, then the trade union movement, and then I moved to the ILO. So I've really been on labor issues practically for all of my professional life. So on one hand, I'm looking forward to retirement, but also with a little nostalgia of, because I loved what I was doing. I've been doing all these years. Trying to defend workers' rights, trying to push workers' issues forward. So it's this kind of mixed feeling. But retirement doesn't mean you kind of fold your hands and don't do anything. So even in retirement, I hope to continue doing the same thing, but maybe at a slower pace.
So in your farewell message, you quoted the former ILO Director General, Phelan, for his strong belief that it's more important to get things done than to get the credit for them. How do you see your contribution to the ILO?
Well, that's a big question, really, because actually it's others to tell me, But I quoted Phelan because he's one of these, if like, quote unquote, underrated director generals. When they talk about directors general, they often talk about the first one and some others, but they hardly ever talk about Phelan. And yet he was the one who did all the work for Butler, the second director general, all the and he was the one who really worked on the Constitution, developed the Constitution, and even the Philadelphia Declaration, which is a seminal declaration in the ILO, he was there also, together with Jenks. So he played a very, very major role in the ILO. Yet, very often is hardly ever talked about, and very often, and even when in his whole life, when he rose up to become Director General, it was a bit of a difficult situation because he was acting Director General, and then the governing body reluctantly, almost reluctantly, appointed him as Director General for I think 2 years, and then that was it. So he's a kind of a person who gave a lot. But understood that what was important was not the recognition he was going to get from it, but the fact of achieving things, getting things done, and he got a lot done. I can't say I'm feeling, but I read his memoirs and it inspired me when I joined the ILO, and so I did my little best, my little bits in ACTRAV, to work on things like EPZs, labor rights. To work on the SDG goals and a whole host of other issues, for which I, together with others, pushed forward in the ILO.
Yeah. So you mentioned some of the topics that you worked closely inside the ILO here. One of them is definitely the question of child labor. Yeah. The question of child labor was really at the heart of your work. What can you say about that?
Yeah, well, child labor is really one of those issues which you find, difficult to accept, personally, because, it's such a revolting issue when you see children, child slaves, child soldiers, children being trafficked and things like that. So it hits you not only intellectually, but in your heart, okay? But child labor has always also been at the heart of my work. And I was one of those, together with others again, because they never do anything alone, who worked hard for the Convention on the Worst Forms of Child Labor. And that was a very, very good moment for us. And it was also it's important, the question of child labor also, particularly in developing countries, because the whole issue is linked to rights to education. Every child must have has a right to education, and every child must be educated. And this is a fundamental issue that, from the development perspective, that we don't talk about enough. So the issue of child labor is a question of rights, but it's also a question of access to education, particularly for the girl child. And all marginalized groups, sometimes in countries you have marginalized groups who are completely marginalized from education. So it's really been something which I've really take to heart a lot.
So one department where you worked is the ILO's Bureau for Workers' Activities, which acts as a main link between the ILO office and the trade union movement. What memories do you have of your time in this department?
Well, I have really, really good memories of my time in ACTRAV. Very, very pleasant. ACTRAV was the idea, actually, original of ACTRAV was Albert Thomas, who created a political department with an advisor for workers' issues and an advisor for employers' issues. That is the origin of ACTRAV and ACTIMP. And during my time in ACTRAV, I saw successive directors and colleagues, and on the whole, it was one of the most beautiful times, experiences of work, because you got a chance to actually be of service to the workers, And so I had one of the best times of my life as an ILO official working in ACTRAV. And I still consider ACTRAV as my home, original home, because we developed so many programs on child labor, on export processing zones, on defending the workers group, preparing for the work, helping the workers group prepare its positions in the governing body. So all these things are things that are quiet in the background, but very, very important. And one thing also which I appreciated a lot was the work on the ground with trade unionists, the training programs, because the training is such a vital element of developing activism, in trade unions. So these were really the when I left ACTRAV, I went into more kind of senior positions, you'd say, but in a sense, I missed the work I was really doing in ACTRAV.
Yeah, you mentioned some of the particularities of this department, but if I ask you the critical importance of workers' education, as you know, we have a program in Turin. Why this program must be reinforced to strengthen trade
Well,
unions?
this is fundamental. Education is fundamental. Training is fundamental, because you have people. For instance, I was involved, for instance, in a period where the World Bank came out with this, what they call PRSPs, poverty reduction strategies, and we were lobbying strongly for workers and trade unions to be around the table. It was supposed to be a participatory process. But it's not sufficient to be around the table. Around the table, fine, good. But it's what content you have, your capacity to articulate the issues that your workers are facing, your capacity to articulate the injustices that people are living through in your country. And you get that capacity through training, ongoing training. So the work on workers' education is so fundamental, a challenge for ACTRAV, but not only for ACTRAV, for the whole of the ILO. We must, lifelong learning is something which is absolutely important to improve our skills and to enhance our skills. For instance, now we have all these very modern technologies available, social media, I have artificial intelligence. And the challenge is, how do we use these for the cause we have to fight social justice? It needs training. Training to how to use the tools and how to use it well to advance our cause for social justice. So workers' education is fundamental. And I think I'm not saying anything new by saying that for the ILO, this is the most important, probably one of the most important areas in which we must invest in.
So before coming to the ILO here, you served also a long time in the trade union movement, especially within the former World Confederation of Labor. Why do you think that trade unions have been and remain important players in advancing social justice for all?
Yeah. Well, trade unions have always played a role in fighting for social justice. In our continent, for instance, in Africa, trade unions played a major role in the decolonization movement. And other countries that have social protection for all, trade unions were at the heart of this. So all the major social fights, social struggles have had trade unions involvement. So trade unions have a fundamental role and have played a fundamental role in the past. Today we are faced with new challenges. And in the 80s, trade unions were under a lot of attack, and a lot of them lost membership and all that. But today we are facing new challenges, which calls on trade unions to reevaluate their strategies, to take a look at themselves also, and to really mobilize themselves together with others, because there are other social movements also, like-minded organizations with whom we have to work in a kind of a broader front, to fight for social justice. So one thing is fighting the traditional trade union issues, collective bargaining and wages and all that, health and safety. But trade unions have the obligation, in fact, they have the responsibility to work with other groups, like-minded groups, in a broad coalition for social justice. And that includes things like fighting in favor of the conditions of the extreme poor, people who are in very, very terrible conditions, the rural poor in the rural areas who are faced with complete marginalization, fighting for social issues like gender equity, protecting the rights of women in society. These are big causes. But today, we have one big issue also that is ahead of us, which is the question of the environmental crisis. And how do we integrate within this challenge of solving the environmental crisis the social dimension? And that is a specific responsibility of trade unions, to put within that framework of a just transition towards a green economy the social dimension, because that is a key element of this transition.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned some of the challenges that we are facing today and multiple crises that we are living. If I ask you, I will say difficult questions. If I ask you 3 tips that you think unions must take in order to be more stronger, more representative, what could be your response to that?
Well, you've taken me a bit by surprise here, but let me just try one thing. One, listen to your members. And listen to members doesn't mean just take their views into consideration. It means taking up their issues. Okay? So that is very, very important. If you want to build a representative organization, it must be an organization that listens to its members and that is driven by its members. A second tip is also to be democratic, to build democratic organizations. We cannot sit on the pulpit and expect our governments to be democratic when we ourselves are not democratic. So pay attention, be democratic, build democratic institutions, membership-based institutions which are strong. And maybe the third thing I'll ask is build up your capacities. Capacity to not only say we are against this, not only say we are against that policy, but capacity to propose alternative policies that are in favor of the large majority of the poor people or poor workers, marginalized groups in society. So it means also that is the capacity to articulate policies which go beyond one's interests as a formal economy worker and takes into consideration the interests also of all those workers who are unorganized, rural workers, poor, informal economy workers and all that. So to answer your question, I just propose these 3 elements for reflection.
Yes, thank you, Claude, for that. Just to come back to the ILO, what is your best memory from after 2 decades of working here?
Well, I've had several memories. I can't single out one. The one that really went, really shook me was the when through ILO's action, Mukhtar Pakpahan, the trade union leader in Indonesia, was freed. Because that was a long struggle to get his freedom. It went through the Committee on Application of Standards several times. The ILO raised the issue several times, and finally he was released. But he wasn't only because he as a person was released, because it meant also that freedom of association was recognized in the country. And that was largely due to the Committee on Application of Standards. That committee is, if you like, one of the jewels in our crown in the ILO. Plays a major role. And in fact, if I think back, all of my, if you like, sweetest moments in ILO have somehow been linked to the work of that committee and the work of the standard setting system of the ILO as a whole. And we do many things in ILO. We work on employment, social protection, on social dialogue and rights and a lot of things, cooperatives and all that. But at the end of the day, when everything, when push comes to shove, when we come down to it, is this standards work, this work on labor standards, which is really the essence of the ILO. The fact that we fix the rules of the game, then we monitor them, and then we bring people or governments that are not applying them to check. And we work with them to improve the living and working conditions of workers. So, and this is largely through the standard system. So my greatest memories have always been, what the ILO has done through its standard setting system and through its conventions and recommendations. And this is really what has brought me the most joy as a person.
You mentioned the critical importance of this standard setting. The ILO is a standard setting organization. And in your view, why we must reinforce this supervisory mechanism of the ILO in the context of this multilateral system?
Well, that has been one of my main points of disappointment, because it looks like the importance that is being given to standards is kind of being diminished a bit. But because the world of work needs rules. We need ground rules below which no one should fall. And if you look at the world of work today, you have so many gaps that still have to be filled. And so the standard setting system is so important to fill all those gaps. I'll give you an example. We're talking about climate change. All the experts say that there's going to be an exaggerated increase or decrease in temperatures. Temperature will probably go very high in some regions. In some other regions, it will go low. We don't necessarily have the standards to fill that gap yet. So we must reinvent it, and we must develop standards, because we have a lot of workers in the agricultural sector who spend the whole day working outside, who are not protected. And I know of in one particular country where they've had cases of renal failure among workers, plantation workers, because those plantation workers did not even have water to drink whilst working outside in those high temperatures. But that's not all. We have the new trends because we have now a digital economy. So it's raising new trends, new questions. How do we govern that? How do we build the ground rules for that, for the digital economy? So we have to be constantly attentive to the changes in society, the changes in the world of work, the changes even in work, and so that we monitor it very closely and build and develop standards. And these standards are there to protect. They're not there to give extra burdens on enterprises. They are there to protect the weakest. And that's why the ILO was built. Even before the ILO was built, in Europe here, one of the main issues was mattress companies and kind of using certain kinds of chemicals which were blowing up. In our countries, in the South, you still have cases like that. You look at the mines. Even though we have conventions, things are still very bad. So we have an awful lot of work to do in not only setting the standards, developing new standards, but also monitoring and working with governments to apply the standards in the countries. This is very, very important because it's not just about laws. It's about human beings. Human beings who have dignity, who have rights, persons. So we cannot be, if like, bureaucratic or neutral about these things. We, the international community, have given us in ILO the mandate to do this job. So we must endeavor at all costs to working with, in the tripartite manner, to develop new standards, to make sure that the weakest in our society are always protected, not only in law, but also in practice.
You mentioned here a lot of challenges that VILO is facing, but if I can ask you one difficult moment that you remember at VILO, what could be your response to that?
Again, difficult question, but clearly linked to your former question, I'll say one of the difficult moments has been the difficulties that we've had in the Committee of Application of Standards in getting consensus between workers and employers. It has been, for me, one of the most difficult, one of the saddest moments. Even during the Cold War, both groups built consensus to develop very progressive standards. And now we have a difficulty, even with the right to strike. It's almost it's an impossible question. So for me, looking back historically, that for me is the saddest moment, for me in the ILO.
So looking forward, you are now preparing your return to Ghana, where you hope to welcome your ILO colleagues, but also your friends to share a meal of jollof rice, as you rightly said. After an intense life at VILO here, what will be your typical day in your country?
I have no idea. I have no idea. All I know is that I need to sleep for a couple of months, and then I need to go with the flow. I go with the flow. But I know that I won't be sleeping much because I already received an invitation to take part in August in a weekend session looking at the youth in Ghana and what are the problems, the challenges of the youth. So, but I'm just going to go with the flow. But I have also some 2 lifelong things I have at heart. I love to paint a bit. I'm not Picasso, but I love to paint, and I'd like to go back to that a bit. And I love African history. So I hope to travel to some places, to Kemet. Kemet is the former name for ancient Egypt. Yes. So that's Kemet. I like to go to Kemet. I like to go to Kush, like the former name for Sudan. It's Kush. But okay, there's a crisis now, so I don't think. I also have a dream of going to Timbuktu, but also there's a crisis there. But I like to, and also to Greater Zimbabwe, and just visit. I think Africa had a history before the colonial period, and our governments haven't probably not kind of insisted on it much. But I've always had it in my heart, and I like to really go and visit the sites and learn more about those civilizations.
Yeah. So last question, Claude, before we close these conversations. Let's imagine that a young student from Accra or any part of the world is watching this interview. What message would you give him or her about joining or supporting the ILO?
Well, I'll just say to that young man or woman that the ILO is a beautiful organization. It's an old organization, almost an ancient organization, over 100 years old. But at its heart, it has very, very beautiful values. It seeks to pursue social justice. So look around yourself. Where are the areas of injustice around that you see as a young person? Identify them and join with others, join with the trade union or organizations to try to improve the situation, and call on the ILO or join the ILO to try to address those situations. Because we in the ILO exist because of that. And so long as there's an injustice in the world, we are called by our founding fathers to fight against those injustices.
Any final word from this conversation, Claude?
Just to thank you, really. I mean, this has been a lovely time for me also. I sent a message out to colleagues and I got a lot of messages back, which have been very touching. I'd just like to thank you and all the colleagues and thank ACTRAV and all the trade unions I work with around the world for giving me the opportunity to learn from them. And I hope I also shared humbly a few things to them. So just to say thank you to everybody.
Thank you very much, Claude, for this conversation. It has been really a pleasure to have this interview with you. I wish you all the best in your retirement in Ghana. Just to remind to our audiences that our guest today is Claude Akpokavie. Claude is a former trade unionist and a senior advisor to the Office of the ILO Assistant Director General for External and Corporate Relations. Thank you for your attention, and we look forward to seeing you soon in a new episode of the Workers' Voices.